But you know, they don't turn around and say Chicago though, when they have 14, 15 a night or black shoes. That's the only guy who's happened. Oh, this was not 15 actually probably. I didn't know it was around. My sister pretty well broke after a big expedition here, you know. Excuse me? Oh, man. Then you're in trouble. Save that till next week. Well, you can't read it. So here you smart aleck. Can't even been on a trailer. Hey, I did get on a trailer. They didn't take my bed. Wait, can I get one of those? Your brother George was, like I told him yesterday, and Vince's pickup broke down. I think when I walked by West, I said, this would never happen at a wolf auction. Jay, I needed a lot of prayers yesterday. He was really hard on me. I believe it. Yeah, just stuck on my case and wait till next week.
Okay, good morning. We're going to continue again here with another video. I don't know, I think it's been a pretty good series. Once again here, he has a good message on the church. If you want to read through those questions, you'll kind of notice that really you don't get any answers in the sermon, so to speak, but that's kind of what makes it interesting, is that there's one message there, and then there's kind of another message with the questions. So we are going to watch about 25 minutes, and then we'll go through a couple questions today.
I can assure you that the men gathered around this table are the best in advertising.
I need your firm to create campaigns targeting 10 significant social and religious issues.
To what end do you want these ad campaigns designed?
To see our culture so swayed by each campaign that gradually and unknowingly people embrace my plan for moral change.
You mean immoral change?
I don't believe that anyone around this table thinks we'll ever see the day when society embraces such outrageous proposals.
Create the campaigns. I will do the rest.
Hurry, gentlemen. We need to get back to the office and tackle the client's next campaign.
Am I the only one who's not afraid to say that the client scares me?
Really?
Hey, he makes my skin crawl.
It's just another client. He's evil.
Maybe. But the money this account brings Wyndham Ridgestone is making us rich.
Then what's not to like about the guy? Question. You guys go to church?
Yeah, Lenore and I go every Sunday.
Vincent?
Do you think I go to church?
Joseph?
Come on, we really want to talk about church over lunch?
It's the target of the client's next campaign. He'd like to see the day when the church is irrelevant.
Good luck there. Everybody goes to church. Well, almost everybody.
Hey, I congregate with others on Sundays. I sit under a steeple. I give money to the racetrack. Hey, Janet and the kids go to church, but Sundays are the only day that I have to have a little fun. Besides, church is for women.
Thanks a lot.
Most people think the church is the moral compass of society. Church is the foundation of an honorable culture.
So you go to church?
No. But I should. Anyway, I just read that fewer people are going to churches on Sundays than ever before.
Because they're all at the racetrack with me.
Well, this campaign should be a breeze, right?
You know, Joseph may have something with the racetrack.
You may be right.
It's a different kind of steeple, but it could work.
What could work?
We take the shame out of not attending church. We position the church as just another social option for the weekend.
We show a racetrack with the tagline steeple chasing.
Then copy reads, people congregate other places on Sundays, and they're not betting on eternity. So come on, live a little in the winner's circle.
It's wrong.
But it works.
I'm sorry, but we'll never see the day when church becomes insignificant in our society.
And now, here is the host of Turning Point, Dr. David Jeremiah.
Hello, I'm David Jeremiah, and welcome to Turning Point. Consider a 2,000-year-old question. Has the Church of Jesus Christ become irrelevant? You are watching week 7 of a special 10-week series of messages called I Never Thought I'd See the Day, Culture at the Crossroads. Trust me, I never thought I'd see the day when the church was viewed as irrelevant by so many, including many Christians. Even people who profess to be Christians are no longer totally convinced of the church's relevance. Let's face it, people attend church for lots of different reasons. The title of today's message, I Never Thought I'd See the Day When the Church Would Be Irrelevant, suggests that many people are looking for a religious experience outside of the church. However, I believe the church is very much relevant, and I'll explain why on today's edition of Turning Point.
The 37 years of Vincent van Gogh's life were tormented years. As many of you know, he was the Dutch painter who lived between 1853 and 1890. He was known mostly for failure and rejection during his lifetime, and in all matters of the heart, romance and painting and faith. Whatever he did seemed to be unrewarded. From a human perspective, it's not difficult to understand why, at the age of 37, he took his own life in despair. Before making a serious commitment to art, Van Gogh had aspired to be a Christian minister. His father was a Dutch Reformed pastor, and his grandfather was a trained theologian. So he grew up in his life with a sensitivity toward God and a concern for people. At one point, he actually joined himself to a Methodist minister for a period, tried to study to take exams for his theological degree, but he failed those exams and subsequently failed another 3-month course at a Dutch school of theology where he was trying to become a missionary. So in 1879, he became a short-term missionary in a coal mining village in Belgium. When he arrived on the scene, he tried to identify himself with the difficult lives of the people in that village. So he lived in a hovel and he slept on a bed of straw. And his ministry and his lifestyle so appalled the local officials that they fired him for undermining the dignity of the ministry. In despair, he turned away from the ministry and to painting. And he spent the rest of his life creating post-impressionistic art that was never recognized at all during his lifetime, but as you know, made his name famous in the world of art after his death. The very last year of Van Gogh's life on this earth, he produced one of his best-known paintings. The painting is called The Church at Auvers. Author Leonard Sweet has called this painting the most haunting painting in the history of religious art. Let me tell you about what's on the screen. The church at Auvers was familiar to Van Gogh. He had seen something similar to it in his travels, and he tried to paint it in detail using his post-impressionistic art. It dominates the entire center of the canvas. The foreground in front of the church consists of a patch of grass, wild flowers, and a roadway approaching the church. But if you'll look closely, you'll notice that there are two important features to the story of this church. First of all, the church has no doors. And second, the road leading to the church splits into a Y right in front of the church, and the two branches bypassed the church on either side, supposedly rejoining on the other side of the church. A woman is walking toward the church on the left-hand branch, and it tells us that the daily travels of the townspeople on the road took them by the church, but never to the church. Because the church has no doors, people on the outside can't get in, and people on the inside can't get out. Whatever the church has inside that might be of benefit, the people outside can't get access to it. And whatever the people outside might need from the church, the people inside can't get it to them. Sitting as it does in the middle of the road, the church appears as something to be bypassed as one is pursuing life's appointments and priorities. It is a dark, obstructing presence, a lifeless relic that people bypass to avoid its cold, inhibiting shadow. Now, these are my interpretations of this painting, not Van Gogh's. He never did write any interpretation of the painting. But my interpretation is held by most others who have studied the painting. Given his failure to qualify to serve God through the church because of its formidable entrance exams, it is not difficult to imagine Van Gogh viewing the church as a dark place, impossible to enter, and an obstacle in the path of life. As I thought on this painting, I wondered, if Van Gogh could paint the American church, what would it look like? If he were to manipulate the sky and the foreground and the light and the shape and the position of the church so to reflect its inner reality, I wonder how much we would like the painting. You see, the issue today with most people regarding the church is that the church has become irrelevant, that the church has nothing to say to the world in which it exists, that the world cares nothing about the church because they perceive that the church cares nothing about the needs of the world. So if you ask people, and we're going to see a survey in a few moments, what they believe to be the importance of the church, you will get many answers. But one of the answers you will hear often is, I don't know why the church has any purpose at all. Now, we have some responsibility in that regard, and I agree with my friend Chuck Swindoll, who wrote a book this last year called The Church Awakening. And in this book, he kind of vented his spleen about some of the things that have happened in the church in recent years. One of the paragraphs in his book, he says, we live in a time with a lot of technology and media. We can create things virtually that look real. We have high-tech gadgets that were not available to previous generations. And we have learned that if we can attract a lot of people to church, if we use these things, it'll work. I began to see that happening about 20 years ago, said Swindoll. It troubled me then, and it's enormously troubling to me now, because the result of an entertainment mentality leads to biblical ignorance. Some time ago, a group of church leaders decided that they didn't want to be hated. So they focused just on attracting more and more people. But if we're here to offer something the world can't provide, why would we copy the world to do it? Martin Lloyd-Jones said it this way, when the church is absolutely different from the world, she invariably attracts it. It is then that the world is made to listen to her message. So if the church is being ignored and considered irrelevant because we preach the message of Jesus Christ and Him crucified, so be it. But if we are deemed irrelevant because we aren't playing the world's game nearly as well as the world does, then that's a tragedy. If we're going to be attacked or ignored by the world, let it be for turning the world upside down like the early apostles did, not because we're just trying to be like the world around us. Somebody has said, there's so much church in the world and so much world in the church, you can't tell the difference between the two anymore. So we're here today to talk about why we have church, why we set aside time every weekend to come here. And I want to start by talking and discussing the reality of the church, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. What is the church? Often people confuse the church, big letter C, with the church, little letter c. Big letter C represents the universal church. Little letter c represents the church building or the local assembly of the church. Now let me explain what I mean. The Bible says that when we become Christians, as soon as we accept Christ as our Savior, we become immediately part of the church of Jesus Christ. It's called the universal church because it is not bound by the boundaries of nations or continents. Everywhere in the entire world where people have accepted Christ as their Savior, they immediately become a part of the body of Christ, which is big letter C, the universal church. We used to call the universal church the invisible church. But then people thought we were talking about Wednesday night, and so we don't do that anymore. One of the clearest pictures that you will ever see that will distinguish between the universal church and the local church is found in a place called Palmyra, New York. Population 7,762. I've been there on a number of occasions. Founded in 1782, this little town is a place where, at least in the 19th century, the church and the churches were anything but irrelevant. Palmyra is one of a handful of towns in the world that have 4 churches built on 4 corners of a main intersection. Can you imagine? In Palmyra, you will find the following churches at one intersection. On one corner, the Presbyterian Church, built in 1832. Across from it, the Episcopal Church, built in 1873. The Methodist Church, built in 1867. And the Baptist Church, built in 1870. All 4 are beautiful, traditional churches with tall steeples that pierce the sky. Every Sunday morning in Palmyra, Christians fill the 4 different churches to worship God, probably in much the same way as they have done for more than a century in that historic town. What happens when these Christians worship in these buildings is that the church, big letter C, is filling the churches, little letter c. In the New Testament, the word for church is a word which refers to the assembly of people. Actually, it's a word made up of 2 Greek words, ek, which is out of, and kaleo, which is to call. So the word church means to call out of. In other words, ekklesia, to call together. The church is a calling together of God's people. And the New Testament writers use the term church 114 times. It is interesting. It always refers to people. Not one time, not one of the 114 times does it refer to a building. You see, when we talk about church today, we talk about a building. When somebody said to you, what are you going to do today? And you said, I am going to church. That's true. You came to the church building, little letter C. Unfortunately, what happens is sometimes our buildings and our facilities and our equipment becomes to us the church when it is only meant to house the church. And when everybody has vacated this building isn't the church anymore. This is just a building. Oh, you call it the church building because it's the building where the church congregates, but the building itself is not a church. The building itself is just the place where the local assembly of the Big C gets together for fellowship and worship. One of the best ways to see this and to picture it is a story that I read years ago in a book by Charles Colson, a book on the church called Being the Body. In this book, he tells about one of his pictures of the church. He writes, one of our favorite pictures of the church comes from the late Richard Halverson. Richard Halverson was the chaplain of the United States Senate, and before that, he was the pastor of the Fourth Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., one of the largest churches in the community. He had been leading that church for years when suddenly one day he saw his church clearly for the very first time. You see, he was flying into Washington one day at dusk, and at that time the approach into Washington, D.C. was to Reagan National Airport, and it happened to go right across the top of the Fourth Presbyterian Church. You could look right down and see the church. But on this particular day, Dick Halverson was pressing his face against the window so he could catch a glimpse of the building in which he ministered. But everything on the ground was shrouded in the shadows falling over the city as the sun set, and he couldn't find his church. He leaned back in his seat, gazing at the Washington skyline, always an inspiring sight when you fly into Washington. And as his eyes followed the Potomac River, he could see the skyscrapers of Roslyn just across the Key Bridge from Georgetown. And then in the distance and to the left, the White House and the lights of the Labor Department and the distant glow of the Capitol Dome. As he stared out the window, he began mentally ticking off the names of the members of his congregation who worked in those office buildings and government bureaus, and suddenly it hit him. And he said out loud, "Of course," and he startled the passenger who was sitting next to him. "Of course, there it is, the Fourth Presbyterian Church." The church wasn't marked by a sanctuary or a steeple. The church was spread throughout Washington in the homes and neighborhoods and offices below him. Thousands of points of light illuminating the darkness. The Church of Jesus Christ isn't a building. The Church of Jesus Christ is the people of God who are part of the congregation, which is worldwide, and we just happen to be the local chapter of the Big C. We come together as God's people and thank Him for these buildings. I've been a pastor for 40 years. I've pastored 2 churches, and I've built 7 church buildings, so I believe in buildings. You got to have a building. Aren't you glad we're not meeting outdoors today? And I love the facility that God has given us. It's been a tremendous tool that He's used. You know, church buildings are sort of like houses for families. Houses bring solidarity to a family. It gives them security, the sense of a place. Church buildings are places where God's people meet to be encouraged and equipped and to be ready to go out and serve Him. But the real church is not here. The real church is out there. And thank you for being salt and light in this community and being the Church of Jesus Christ. Discussing the reality of the church. Remember, the church, Big C, is the universal church. Little c is the local assembly, often referred to in the building. Discussing the reality of the church is followed by determining the relevancy of the church. So let me ask this question again. Who needs the church? People today are doubting the importance of the church. Why go to church? I have a whole spate of books in my office that have titles that ask that question. Here's one: Quitting the Church. Life after church. So you don't want to go to church anymore. They like Jesus, but not the church. And the American church in crisis. The irrelevance of the church has become a very relevant topic among Christians and non-Christians alike. Back in 2010, George Barna and his organization, which is a polling group, compiled a survey of opinions about the church from a cross-section of Americans, and the results were not encouraging. 20% of those who responded cited violence or hatred in the name of Christ. 13% cited opposition to gay marriage. 12% cited involvement in politics, and another 12% recent abuses involving Catholic priests. Now, of course, when you survey a secular culture, you should expect that they are not going to say good things about Christians who hold to a narrow view of morality. We shouldn't worry about the criticisms with that. If we're doing the right thing and doing what God has called us to do, we're not going to be popular with everybody. But some of the things on that list we do need to take seriously if we're going to be the church that God wants us to be. Now, when I read from history how the Christian church was described in the early years, and this is not a good old days story, this is just going back to the early days of the church, it's evident that they were having an impact in their culture that somehow we have gotten away from. Rodney Stark is a modern scholar who has written about the early and modern Christian church, and he says this about the church in its early years. Listen carefully. Christianity revitalized life in the Greco-Roman cities by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships that were able to cope with many urgent problems. Listen, to cities filled with the homeless and the impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachment. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities faced with epidemics, fire, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services. For what they brought, said this author, was not simply an urban movement, but a new culture that was capable of making life in the Greco-Roman cities far more tolerable for those who lived there. In other words, Christianity in the beginning was a salt and light ministry that created a huge difference of transformation wherever it was located. If you went into a city and there was some semblance of civilization there, and there was a semblance of goodwill there, if you looked around, normally you would end up finding a church, a group of Christians. Recently, we had one of our missionaries telling us the story of a place where they went, where there was no language, where there was no Bible, and where the culture was primitive. In fact, had recently finished being so primitive that they were eating one another. They were cannibals. This couple went there, and they created a language for these people. They had no written language. They had nothing to memorialize the sounds, and they listened, and they got them, and they found a way to write it. They created the whole alphabet for the language. They created the whole language itself. And then, taking the new language, they translated portions of the New Testament. First of all, some of the key stories from the New Testament, and ultimately the entire New Testament. Now watch this. They're writing the New Testament out of a language that did not exist before they went there. They taught them the New Testament, and the natives began to understand the gospel and become Christians. Where there had been no culture, where there had been no civility, where there had been no language, all of a sudden, churches began to pop up all around. And now if you go back there, it's like walking into an old-time village with concern and care and medicine and hope and help and godliness. The Church of Jesus Christ made a difference. That story has been told in church over and over again.
All right. We'll get to the questions here in a second. Would any of you be interested in like looking at these pictures? If you're, I'm not cultural enough to figure out the painting and what it really meant when he described the church that had the paths going around it. And not relevant because nobody could get in the church, no doors, and nobody that were in there, could come out. The idea of that the church is just a country club, I think, is what he was trying to say, maybe, and is that a problem of today, that where you are just going there for social benefit? He had another painting that's called The Starry Night, and it is another one that is a little bit haunting, like you said, where the city's lights were all twinkling, but the church was dark. It was the only building in town that was dark. Again, because I think Van Gogh was not accepted in his church, and they kind of kicked him out. He turned away from it, and still having ideas about it. So, it really does make you think. Is that what are we doing as a body of believers? Are we putting that message out to the community that it is it's just for people who go there and nobody else, or there's no help that can be sought there? So what the questions are in our lesson here are, I'm sure you all know these questions and the answers, but it's kind of like a review for how do we reach the world, and what is the church really, what was it really founded on, and what was it meant for? How many of you thought the steeple was an interesting concept? It may have been, I don't know, but nowadays, I think if you got a tall steeple, I kind of shy away from those places. To doesn't seem to have the meaning of God being number one, pointing to the heavens like it used to. I mean, these big churches now are so much entertainment, and not all, I'm sure, but I would say that kind of thing is changing for sure. But let's go to Matthew 16, the beginning of the church. Beginning as the church is told, it didn't start for a couple more months here back in the day, but here's where we have to start. So 16, 13 through 20, if someone wants to read that.
The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus, wanting to trick him, so they asked him to show them a miracle from God. Jesus answered, "At sunset you say, we will have good weather because the sky is red."
That must be, is it Matthew? Did I say Matthew?
Matthew 16, yeah.
Okay.
That doesn't look at all like
Verse 13? Verse 13?
Matthew 16. Verse 13? Oh, okay.
Yeah, 13 through 20 there.
Okay. 13 through what?
20.
And Jesus came to the area of Caesarea and asked the followers, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They answered, "Some say you are John the Baptist, others say you are Elijah, and still others say you are Jeremiah, one of the prophets." Then Jesus asked them, "And who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus asked, "You are blessed, Simon, son of Jonah, because no person taught you that. My Father in heaven showed you who I am. So I asked you, you are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the power of death will not be able to defeat it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The things you don't allow on earth will be the things that God does not allow, and the things that you allow on earth will be the things that God allows." Then Jesus warned the followers not to tell anyone he was Christ.
Okay. Question number one there. What was the subject of Jesus' discussion with his disciples in verse 13?
You want to know who he was, what they thought who he was.
Who do people say that I am? Now, why would he ask this question?
He's just checking what they really thought of him.
Okay, what did they, if we went back in just a couple pages in Matthew, what was Jesus up to? Yeah, miracle after miracle shown, and in the Old Testament said, that to recognize the Son of God, you're going to see miracles and rising from the dead and lame walk and the blind see. And yet, after all these miracles, who are the people saying he is? Not the Son of God, were they? Elijah coming back. They knew about Elijah coming back. They knew that John the Baptist, that one, is that a quick resurrection? Because, he just got killed there. Nobody was saying, or I shouldn't say nobody, maybe, but few, if any, were saying he was the Son of God. He was actually God. So when Peter said this, what did he say here? It says, what answer did Peter give that gained Jesus' approval?
When he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
You are the Christ. You're the Son of the living God.
But see, he was the only one out of the whole works that said it too. The rest of them were all.
Yeah. And so what does he say in verse 17 about that? Only because he only said that because God gave him insight and allowed him to say that. And that's where this kind of goes here that gets a little interesting. See there, Peter's name, Petros, means stone, whereas rock, Petra, means bedrock. What bedrock was Jesus referring to in verse 18 upon which he could build his church? So Peter means stone or pebble. I've always heard it as pebble. And the rock then is what?
The rock is Christ.
Okay, the rock is Christ. Now, I have to say that God revealed that to you because a lot of the churches don't believe that's true. A lot of the churches think that Peter's got this power. So, just to clarify, let's go to Matthew 21:42 if someone wants to look that up. Genesis 49:24 and 1 Peter 2:1-8. Matthew 21:42.
Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes."
Okay, so the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So where did that come from? What part of the Scriptures? That's in the Old Testament Psalms, right? So this is something that they should have known. For one thing, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they should have known there is a stone, there is a rock that's coming, and the world's going to reject them. It still is. Okay, Genesis 49:24.
But his bow remained steady, his strong arms stayed limber, because the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel.
Okay, here it talks about the shepherd being the rock. And who's the shepherd of Israel? Christ. And so we're just adding to the story that the rock here isn't the first time they should have heard about this. Okay, 1 Peter 2:1-8.
Therefore, putting aside all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, like newborn babies long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you grow in respect to salvation. If you have tasted the kindness of the Lord, and coming to him as a living stone, which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built upon a spiritual house for the holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value is for you who believe, but for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they were also appointed.
Yeah, a big verse there on, again, proving that Jesus is the stone, is the rock. And would the believers become rocks also? Because we're built on that same, we're built on the foundation of the cornerstone rock. We are part of that building, the capital C church. Okay. So if Jesus were referring to Peter's confession, verse 16, as the foundation of the church, how does that help define the church's mission? So what, in other words, are we to do if Peter says, what is our message according to what Peter said?
We're to tell the world that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God.
Okay, so that is our main message. There's another question coming here we'll get to next week, but so we kind of get away from that somehow it's our responsibility to force people to come to Christ, and it's just not possible. Yeah, he's the one who, same with Peter, he's the one who opened Peter's eyes. We're to tell, we're to go and share, but what? Leave the results up to? Yeah, so the saying is, go in the power of the Holy Spirit, right? But leave the results up to God. Okay, so So the authority then is Christ's. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but it's a good review again for the world, because we do confront these things, seems like lately here on a regular basis. Our people are not accepting Jesus for who he is. Even the Christian church now has become Chrislam in some of these churches, mating Christianity and Islam together because they say we have the same God. And big leaders are talking about this, and it's a movement, and it just isn't anywhere close to the truth. So Matthew 28 again. We're going to look at 18 through 20, Matthew 11, 25 through 27, Daniel 7, 13 through 14. We'll start with those three. Got just a couple minutes here. Steal your time. Matthew 28, 18 through 20.
Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Spirit, and teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the end of the age.
Okay, verse 18 there, it says, And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. So, all authority. Jesus is the only one that has been given all authority. And that is our main message. Jesus is the one. Okay? Matthew 11, 25 through... Matthew 11, 25 through 27. At that time Jesus answered and said, I praise thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that thou didst hide these things from the wise and intelligent, and did reveal them to babes. Yes, Father, for thus it was well-pleasing in thy sight. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him. Okay, so again, we see the power of Christ here has been given to him by the Father. And another thing that's interesting is he hid this from the wise and intelligent. And we see that today in abundance. The people in power and lord it over us are ungodly people. They just have a one-track mind, and it's for themselves. Again, not all. Okay, so it's, again, his, all things have been handed over to Christ. Daniel, did someone look up Daniel 7? 13 through 14.
In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion and will not pass away. And his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed.
Okay, again, Old Testament passage. Daniel said, the Son of Man, which he called himself the Son of Man. Jesus called himself the Son of Man on the earth. And he was given authority from the Ancient of Days, which had been the Father. So they should have seen what was going on here, the studiers of the Scriptures, but blindness and other motives took over their lives there. It's almost 20 after. I think we'll have to end that there. We'll pick it up there. I got a few more verses there. If you want to fill out those rest of those questions, and we have, I think, about 15 minutes left of the video, and then so we'll have a little more discussion time next week. Okay. Thanks for coming this morning.